hit the
Yeah.
yeah, so we're recording now, and I'm Edwin Rutch, the director of the Empathy Center. So I've worked for about 15 years on the topic of how do we create a more empathic society, and here with Graham Bodie. And I just looked up at what kind of but your more official bio, Graham, is that you're internationally recognized expert on listening, and you've published monographs, books, encyclopedia entries, and you've co-edited a book, the Handbook of Listening. It's the first comprehensive interdisciplinary research on the topic, and you're professor of media and communication at the University of Mississippi, and your website is grahambodie.com. Is there something else you'd like to add about just introducing yourself?
No, that's good. As the quote goes, right? Yeah, people generally teach what they're bad at, right? So maybe there's maybe there's some truth to why I focus so much on listening, because maybe I'm not so great at it sometimes.
Yeah, I wonder if that's with empathy too, huh?
Who knows? Who
Yeah,
knows?
with me with empathy. So, yeah, well, the reason we got connected was you did a post on LinkedIn and about how do you empathize, and it was more about defining empathy, or we're trying to shift from something you call perspective taking to perspective getting. And
Yeah.
I just saw your post, and you wrote about that, and I've been working on a definition of empathy project as well. It's kind of like my main project right now. Is I just see there's so much confusion, about the definition of empathy. Seems like on the academic side, it's totally a mess in terms of how people are using the word empathy. And there's a lot of criticisms coming, new books out, like, The Sin of Empathy, Toxic Empathy, Suicidal Empathy, Against Empathy, just, you know, all this sort of negative criticism. And I think a lot of that comes from just a lack of understanding what we're talking about, that we're really just talking past each other. Most of the criticisms, I think, is not even really criticizing empathy. It's like things that are not empathy. So I just see that the definition is really important, and especially since I want to well, we're working on creating an empathy movement, make mutual empathy a primary cultural and social value. And, you got to be clear on what we're talking about. So, anyway, just wanted to see what your thoughts were about kind of exploring this topic. What got you to even write that blog post?
Yeah. So that particular post was really more of a kind of the culmination of an exercise that started with a talk that I gave several years ago. I think I've given the same talk a couple of times now, but the original one was with a group. It's an online app that recruits people to well, they call it listening, but really it's texting. So if you're stressed out and you don't have anybody to talk to at that moment, maybe it's 2 o'clock in the morning, and you woke up and you're thinking about something, you can go onto this app and request a listener. And these individuals are trained, and so I did some training for those listeners, they asked me to come in and talk about some work that I've done and published on active empathic listening. So this term active listening, of course, is originally attributed at least to Carl Rogers, and what Carl Rogers meant when he used the term active listening has ultimately been bastardized by corporations and entities that are trying to make a buck on corporate training or workshops and so forth. It's been turned into a set of techniques. So if you just nod your head and say uh-huh, and maybe paraphrase a little bit and ask a question, then you can check all those boxes and you can say, like, I'm an active listener. And then, of course, people lop on this notion of empathy on top of that. Others and I have called this sort of the adjectification of listening, where you deep listening, mindful listening, active listening, empathic listening, right? And there's any number of hundreds of different terms. So very much like empathy having multiple definitions, listening also has multiple definitions. And as an academic exercise, it's really not a big deal, right? You can have multiple definitions. Definitions are simply functional. In the realm of the academy, they allow people to understand this is what I'm studying. These are the things I'm not studying. So as an academic exercise or as a scholarly exercise, it makes no difference. You define a term and then you move on and you do your study. Of course, in the realm of everyday interactions with people, if I run around with one definition of listening or one definition of empathy, and then you have another definition of listening or a definition of empathy, that can cause problems, right? Because you get into these weird debates or arguments. You say, "You're not listening to me." "Yes, I am." "No, you're not." Yeah, and we have this kind of meta weird argument or conflict about whether or not I'm engaging in this thing that we are both calling listening, but I have one set of criteria in my mind about what constitutes effective and good and competent listening, and you have maybe a completely different set of criteria for what that means. So in terms of empathy and how I sort of am connecting this to listening, is really out of what most in the academic literature refers to sort of cognitive empathy, or this idea of perspective taking. And in the academic literature, it's largely imaginative perspective taking, where you're either imagining yourself as the other, right? Or if I were in this person's shoes, how would I feel? How would I react? What would I do in that situation? So this kind of self-oriented perspective taking. Or you're imagining not how I would react if I were in that situation, but attempting to imagine how the other person likely feels given that they are in that situation. So this kind of other-oriented perspective taking. And what the research does when they distinguish these two things is the study suggests that other orientation produces less anxiety, less negative things come from when I imagine the other's perspective as opposed to imagining myself in that person's perspective. But also that literature suggests that we're really pretty terrible at imagining what other people are experiencing. I'm not that other person. I never will be that other person. I can never really fully imagine that other person. And so I'm contrasting that in this LinkedIn post with what Nicholas Epley and others call perspective getting. That Epley's quote is something like, we're not wired. Humans are not wired to imagine the perspective of another. And so the better tool to use to fully understand another person are the ears, not the mind. So what we ought to be doing is asking strategic questions to open space for that person to tell us what it is they're experiencing, how it is they're experiencing that thing. And through a process of dialogue and deliberation or whatever other kinds of communicative exchanges that we might have with that person, we can get their perspective and we can, quote unquote, empathize much better when we operate in a perspective getting mode as opposed to a perspective taking mode. So that was really the contrast I was trying to make with that particular LinkedIn post.
Yeah, that differentiation is what I've been looking at as well. So my work is also very much built on the work of Carl Rogers, and he used the active listening process in the therapeutic context, listening to his clients, just kind of being present with them and listening to them. And then he also called that active listening, but also that it was an empathic process of sensing the wholeness of who they are, their thoughts, feelings, desires, dreams, just whatever needs, whatever comes up, the wholeness of their being, and you're sensing into it. And then you're trying to differentiate that from sort of that imagining yourself in their situation or imagining them in their situation. And those are two different phenomena. So that's become very, I think, in the academic field, very confusing in terms of that it's not quite well sort of articulated. It seems to me that and you and then these terms cognitive empathy and affective empathy I think are just very ineffective models. So I'd love to get away from those terms altogether. So I don't know if you saw the slideshow that I did on kind of how I'm looking at defining empathy. Uh, did you take a look?
The one that you sent. Yeah, yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Well, it's basically that sort of a basic empathy, and what Rogers would call empathy is what you were describing as perspective getting. You're with the person, you're hearing what they're saying. You know, you may be using active listening to reflect back so you're sure you're having an error checking, right? Did I get it or not?
Mm-hmm.
And then even by listening to them and doing that active listening, it often invites people to say more and they sort of open up. So for me, that's like a basic empathy, just sensing into. And I'm also working on the definition, trying to define empathy within the context of the empathy circle. So I find the definitions get rather abstract, about what people are talking about, and using the empathy circle model, with maybe four or five people in a circle, one person is the speaker, one person is the listener, and then the listener is, using active listening to listen to the speaker, and it's sort of turn taking. So yeah, so that's and so I'm trying to explain that model that there's different components of empathy. There's the basic empathy, and the other, what you're calling perspective taking, I would call imaginative empathy. That you're imagining
Yeah.
yourself, and it can be, and imagination is kind of the broad term for imagining kind of anything. I can imagine myself being an animal. I can imagine myself in the future. And then the perspective taking is maybe a bit more focused on imagining a relationship with another person. Is how I'm seeing sort of that
Yeah.
difference. And then the other part of that cognitive empathy, it seems to be understanding, right? That you have that understanding, and they have imagining, and then you have perspective taking, or sort of components of cognitive empathy. And but it is at the core more, and it's even not even consistent among the academics. They might throw other things in like projection or other. So they're even kind of inconsistent. There's even no consistency within that framework. So anyway, um, I think I guess the core is trying to define empathy within the context of an empathy circle. What's happening in the empathy circle? So if somebody really wants to understand empathy, take part in an empathy circle and experience these different phenomenon. So I don't know how that kind of resonates or makes sense to you.
Yeah, and I don't want to suggest, and I'm not saying that you're suggesting either, that there's like no place for imagination inside of empathizing with or trying to understand others, or even trying to be a better communicator or a better listener. There's a whole there's a theory called imagined interactions theory, was developed by a colleague of mine when I was at Louisiana State University, Jim Honeycutt. And that whole theory is about how do we properly and appropriately and effectively imagine possible interactions that we're going to have with people. So this isn't, like imagining that I'm having a conversation with someone that I'll never talk to, although that's certainly, fun, I suppose, if you're going to imagine a relationship with your favorite actor, or, someone that is deceased, or something where, you want to have a connection with with a grandparent or something like that. But this is literally like planning for upcoming conversations, or like redoing. Everybody's had that experience, right? Where you have a conversation and you leave, and 5 minutes later, you're like, I really wish I would have said X,
Mhm.
right? I really wish I would have done, this thing. And it's like, well, is it too late to do that? And so his research suggests that there's a variety of attributes or characteristics of imagined interactions, as well as a variety of functions that they serve, right? They can serve to help with conflict or social support, or a variety of other things. And the point isn't to get in the weeds of the theory, but to suggest that when done properly, this notion of imagination of the kinds of conversations you want to have with someone, if done in a way that isn't that's specific but not too specific, right? You don't want to try to say, when he says this and I'll say this, and he says this and I'll say this, and then of course, if it goes off the rails, then you don't know what to do next. But if it's got a certain level of specificity and so forth, then those kinds of imaginative practices can actually be generative and helpful and productive, and create more effective conversations. If we can plan for how we want the conversation to progress, that can do a lot of good, right? The problem, of course, is when we replace actual interaction with another person with some imagined sequence of events, or imagining how they, even something simple like, what to get someone for their birthday, right? I can imagine what they would like, and then I can go out and buy it. Or I can just ask them, like, what would you like for your birthday? They're probably going to like the present that they helped to construct a lot better than the present, that I imagined, and didn't quite fit the bill, as it were, for that particular. It's great when people read our minds correctly. The problem is that most people don't read our minds very well most of the time, right? And so, as it's kind of an interesting phenomena that we're seeing now, which is kind of this reaction against empathy, is really a reaction against a bastardized version of, ultimately, it's not even empathy, as you say, right? It's something other than empathy. And similarly, when Carl Rogers was writing, it seems sort of not all that amazing now, right? That we treat people as humans, right? It's like, duh, we should do that. We should humanize people, right? But back then, he was reacting to a particular kind of clinical encounter that did not assume that people had the skills and abilities to become better themselves, right? So he was reacting to, right, kind of not only Freudian psychoanalytic methods, but also this idea of this kind of stimulus response model within psychology, right? So his humanistic approach to therapy was paradigm shifting, right? It completely upended the paradigm of what was appropriate and effective therapy, and so much so that it just seems commonplace today to treat people as empowered and able to, and competent enough to to help themselves, as it were, right? So the therapist role is much more about helping people see the causes and consequences of whatever it is that they're dealing with, and allowing them to kind of co-create that therapeutic experience. And again, that was paradigm shifting back then, and I think we lose sight of that now. We just sort of say, like, of course that's the way that therapy should work, or of course that's the way change should work in a situation where you might face a daily stressor. But it certainly wasn't the leading paradigm, which is why his work was so so impactful when it was. And yet we've taken what he developed, right, when he was developing, and we've turned it in simply to a checklist, right? If we just check these boxes, then we're we're automatically this good listener. When the whole point is to be focused on the other, even as we're being sort of genuine to our own standpoints and perspectives.
Yeah, well, he talked about a way of being. It wasn't that he even
Yeah.
from what it's like it's a whole attitude of being that it incorporates, and I find that with the empathy circle, people don't need to know a lot about empathy or listening. They just kind of do the process, and it kind of helps you just develop that sort of that way of being more sensitive to the felt experience of others, to their humanity, to also being feeling that, oh, I can share whatever is going on with me, and I'm going to be heard in the group, right? So I don't have to be
Right.
feel intimidated. I don't have to hide myself, and it's sort of a trust building process. So, but do you have a sense? Because for me, it was like he did just this great work. Rogers did a great work on this developing, active listening, describing the process, the articulating, how empathy works, just the benefits of it. And then and that's sort of the thread, I've been following. And then I kind of start getting into the academic work. And it's like these concepts like cognitive empathy, affective empathy, empathic concern, maybe being compassion. Like he never used any of those terms. He didn't, for him, it was like you listen, which you would be perspective getting, your definition. He would just be getting the person's perspective, right? He didn't,
Hmm.
he, or, and, and so he didn't kind of divide the person into an affective and a cognitive component, kind of divide the person. But I think he just saw people as a whole, and I think that's what sort of has gotten the definition of empathy off track, getting it into this cognitive affective uh, model. So anyway, the way I'm trying to define it now to kind of simplify it is there's sort of the basic empathy, which you would call perspective getting, when you're actually with someone, listening to them, sensing, hearing what they're saying. It's sort of in the wholeness of who they are, going in deeply. There's the empathy circle, the active listener is doing that when they listen to the speaker. And then there's the imaginative part. And we do that in role playing, where when we're doing our training on how to, learn to be an empathy circle facilitator, we say, okay, we're going to have a scenario here that you're a family member, a sibling, and you're four siblings in the circle, and with a facilitator, and your parent just passed away, and there's an inheritance of several $100,000 that you're supposed to be divided among you, and you each feel you should get all of it. And now you have to argue from your point of view, and we kind of give the different scenarios for each member, and they imagine themselves being in that situation, and then they argue, but they use empathic listening in the process. So you have the perspective getting, they're doing perspective getting through, which I would call just basic empathy. And then they also have that imaginative part where they're imagining themselves in those roles of this
Hmm.
person who, we've given them the scenario of who that person is. And that's what I'm calling imaginative empathy, that you can just imagine yourself in any role, any situation. So just kind of giving it a term, and it's a different way of getting knowledge. It's good, it's positive, and but it's different from just basic empathy. Basic empathy is another way of just gaining of knowing, So, and then also adding self-empathy. And I think Rogers, he didn't, I don't think he really used the word self-empathy, but he sort of described it, that when somebody listens to you empathically, you're actually able to empathize better with yourself, with your own felt experiences. You're kind of given space to go into yourself. And he didn't use the word self-empathy, but he said you're kind of like your own therapist, which is similar. I mean, the spirit is similar to self-empathy to what he was describing. And then another aspect is what I was calling holistic empathy, because I think that's something that in the academic world, it's very much individualistic, and I hear that from others in the psychology. it looks at the individual, as the core person, is a core focus. What's the individual doing? The individual is empathizing with someone else, but they don't talk about so much, or a little, maybe a little bit here and there, about there's a relationship between all these people in the circle, let's say, that there's a quality of connection, like with you and I here, there's a quality of connection between us. And I would
Hmm.
call that holistic empathy. How are we both listening to a certain degree? What's the level? So that can be a high degree of empathy, holistic empathy in the relationship, or a low degree. And, you're sensitive to the feeling of the group. And that's not talked about so much, but I think it's something that's needed especially since our goal is to make, the culture more empathic as a whole. And you can sort of say, I would say right now it's kind of a low ebb, in terms of its empathy. So that's sort of the basic model I'm kind of working on right now. So I don't know how that model lands with
Yeah,
you.
in the context, a couple of things that made me think. One is, of course, Rogers was a proponent of these, three core conditions for therapeutic change, right? So he used the word empathy specifically to describe the therapist understanding the client's world from the perspective of the client, right? So from that person, and like you said, he advocated this notion of perspective getting. He didn't call it that, but that's what we might call it. Is the way to empathize is to really truly sort of fully listen to how the other individual is speaking, what's the language they're using, and you're trying to do that without any kind of judgment. Although I would kind of quibble with whether that's even possible. I mean, we're always judging. There's always a process of us comparing, even if we can try to mitigate some of that or remind ourselves that we're not supposed to be doing that. And so that was his empathy condition. And then there's this unconditional positive regard, which is I'm taking a stance with it when I hear whatever it is that you're expressing. I'm not evaluating that as good, bad, or whatever. I'm not necessarily being indifferent about it, but I'm trying to react in a way that creates sort of a space for vulnerability so that the person keeps talking, right? So whether that's in the empathy circle, right, reflecting on, checking my understanding about, paraphrasing back my understanding and so forth. And then that third one, which actually he wrote about a little bit in terms of what he struggled with, was this notion of congruence, right? Which is being genuine and authentic, allowing the sort of just being my true self. And so maybe that aligns with this idea of self empathy, or like really understanding my own thoughts and perspectives, right? And then you're right also, with respect, like, psychology is inherently individualistic, right? It assumes the individual and their thoughts are the center of theory making. And anytime, of course, that you're in an interaction with another person, whether that's imagined or real, there's a dynamic,
Mm.
right? There's always an exchange. So you've got to go beyond the individual, at least to the dyadic. And from my work on listening, it's interesting to think about how this term listening sort of has developed or evolved over time from being kind of solely an intra-individual experience, just me processing information that comes through my ears. Actually, way back in the 40s and 50s, there were three terms that were used. It was hearing, which was the physiology. It was listening, which was mere comprehension. And then there was a term called auding, Auding, that was this notion of meaning making and sort of using schema to understand and to process things, right? Now we've since kind of dumped this term auding, and now we make a distinction in the academic literature between hearing and listening is this higher order meaning making process that involves understanding, comprehension, evaluation, and sort of generating a response as a function of what I've heard. But all that to say that listening has also evolved from an intra to an interpersonal phenomenon. So I'm not only doing something in my mind, but I'm engaging as a listener. So I'm sort of got this ontology or this beingness as a listener. So I can be a listening being, for instance, right? It's a state of existence, right? To be a listener, and people are judging me about whether I'm a good listener or not based on how I'm acting and reacting to them. And then, and even more recently, in the last 10 to 20 years, the term listening has been attached to what organizations do or how societies are structured. So societies or organizations or larger entities like governments can be structured as listening entities or as speaking entities, right? So, if you think about your own government where you are, or even the national government, it's much more, it's structured much more as a push or a speaking entity, right? It wants to get its message out. It wants to tell people about public health. It wants to tell people about information. It wants to sort of, market or communicate to, and very little money is spent and very few resources are spent on actually hearing the perspective of the people that it's meant to serve in the first place, right? So a town hall or a listening session, right? And I put that in quotes because oftentimes a listening session is no more than a politician coming out to an event that's an hour, speaking 45 minutes into a microphone, and then opening the floor for 15 minutes of question and answer that gets three people to come to the microphone, and ultimately those three people don't really even get to feel heard, right? So imagine a government that's built on an infrastructure not of speaking, but an infrastructure truly of listening to its publics, right? We don't know what that looks like in this country, right? The art of deliberation has been lost with history to a certain extent, right? That our only deliberative act nowadays is pushing a button in a little booth, once every year, once every 4 years. And so all that to say that, empathy, I think you're right to try to conceptualize it on these different levels. There's an intra individual level, there's an interpersonal or sort of dynamic, sort of dyadic level, and then there's larger and larger kind of societal levels where we can think about what you call holistic listening or holistic empathy. Is how is our society built to encourage and teach and value empathy or value, right, listening, right? What are the incentives that we have to be empathic? What are the incentives that we have to truly give perspectives that are not that are divergent from our own fair consideration, right? And if we're honest, there's very little incentive to give other perspectives the time of day, right? In the kind of society that we built, and so I think that's the power of an empathy movement, is to try to shift society toward those incentive structures that allow for really meaningfully connecting and humanizing other people, especially those that we disagree with or that are different from us, that have different world experiences. And very similarly to that, building an infrastructure in our government and in other spaces where people feel heard, not just for the sake of feeling good about ourselves, but actually so that our perspectives are incorporated into decision making.
Yeah, so your work has been on listening, and I see empathy and listening sort of the same thing at the core. It's
Yeah.
maybe empathy is just a deeper form of listening that was maybe brought in to put a little bit more emphasis on the whole person, on the felt experience that the other has. So say that, hey, in the relationship, there's these qualities of feeling, and you want to be sensitive to these qualities of feelings that others have. So I don't know. I guess I think we're working on the same basic, program here. So in terms of,
Yeah.
with listening, and so um, yeah. So in terms of the definition of empathy, the other part is the affective, what's called affective empathy. I don't know if you've looked much into that uh, that term? Have
Yeah,
you?
I mean, I'm familiar, right? I mean,
Okay.
usually when you look at measures of empathy, you've got items that reflect affective empathy, you've got items that reflect cognitive empathy, and then you've got items that reflect what's called emotional contagion, or the degree to which you sort of catch the feelings, right, of another person. So there's those kind of three components in most of those measures.
Yeah. So in terms of the cognitive empathy, the main subcategories is understanding. That's cognitive, but understanding for me, I don't know if you have a different, is sort of just creating a map of the other person. As I listen to you, I create sort of a picture of who you are, what your thought process is, what's important to you, what your feelings are, maybe where the feelings come from. And so I create this sort of map of understanding of who you are. Is that sort of how you're understand the word understanding, or?
Yeah, so I mean, again, to me, terms are definitions. Terms like understanding, I treat them as what we might call a theoretical term. So they have their meaning as they're embedded in a particular theory, right?
Mhm.
And so most of the theories that I deal with or use to understand what this notion of listening is, understanding is a particular kind of uh, uh, um, it's a function of listening that involves making meaning, right? Which is different from what we might call comprehension, which is simply being able to. I don't want to use the term understanding to describe it as a sort of looking up and trying to think. So, comprehension is, if you say, a sentence, can I tell you exactly what sentence you said, right? Can I tell you the words that you said? I can just repeat back to you exactly, right, what you said. And whereas understanding is I'm understanding, sort of semantically what you're trying to mean by saying that sentence, and then further along the processing continuum, you've additionally got kind of act recognition that not only do I understand the meaning you're trying to make, I understand what you're trying to do, right? What you're trying to accomplish, right? So with that statement, you are threatening or promising or requesting or whatever, right? So in kind of discourse, sort of discourse processing, or as I make sense of the conversation that we're having, I'm simultaneously hearing, comprehending, understanding, and recognizing the sort of pragmatics of what you're trying to accomplish by saying those words as opposed to other words you might say, or whatever, right? Those are when you throw around these terms. In my mind, I'm trying to also kind of reconcile between an understanding from maybe an empathy circle perspective versus an understanding from maybe a discourse processing perspective, as it were.
Yeah. So anyway, under cognitive empathy, there is that understanding which we just talked about, and then there's the perspective, taking the perspective or imagining. So, and they often say it's like without feeling what the other person is feeling, and that gets a little confusing in the sense that it kind of takes in this notion of feeling and reason are two different things. And
Mm,
and I think that I see that sort of as problematic too, that they're so intertwined, if they're even separable, that, every
right.
thought you have, even when you're reasoning, you feel the experience of the reasoning. It's like I've done interviews or empathy circles on what does reason feel like? The reason has a felt experience to it. So, this trying to so rigidly pull them apart, I think is almost in effect. I mean, it's almost, I don't know. I can't, it just doesn't seem very doable or even effective. So when I'm listening to you, I'm just listening to your whole sense. I'm not saying I'm not like separating your feelings and your reason. So anyway, I
Mm,
see that as another kind
yeah.
of issue. And that kind of comes under cognitive empathy too, as a sort of a caveat. They always throw that in as a caveat. So
Yeah, I mean, it's in, and even some theories of emotion suggest that the reason that we feel one emotion as opposed to some other emotion is because we place a cognition on top of it, right? So, if you say, your heart's racing, your palms are sweating, your pupils are dilating, and your blood pressure rises, what emotion is that, right? I mean, it describes all the emotions, right? There's no physiological pattern for fear that's distinct, in all of the different ways it could be distinct from anxiety, from joy, from, so if my heart's racing and my blood pressure rises, and someone is giving me flowers and I like that person, right? Versus those things are happening and I'm given flowers by someone who I think is a creep, those are two different emotions, right? And the only way for me to understand which of those emotions I'm feeling is to place a cognition on top of it. So, where is the feeling and where is the reason? I agree. I think it's hard, if not impossible, to, maybe it's just a function of our sort of Western, way of thinking, that we can even sort of pull apart reason or logic from feeling or emotion. And then you've got, of course, dual process models like Jonathan Haidt's work on moral reasoning, where we're making moral judgments first and foremost because of a initial kind of knee jerk or gut level emotional reaction, and only after the fact that we plop over a justification that has any kind of reason, to it. And then we're trying to distinguish those things, right? It's like, well,
Yeah.
which one is which? Yeah,
And can you even tell me something where you're reasoning and then feel what the experience is like? So it seems like even when you're
yeah,
reasoning, the reasoning has a it's almost you cannot not reason, you can't not feel your reason if you really get down to the subtlety of the experience, So
yeah. You
a
can't
lot of
reason without feeling.
yeah,
Yeah,
yeah. So anyway, it's there's all these kind of aspects that are kind of messing up the empathy movement in terms of let's get
yeah,
something that's practical. So anyway, that's how I'm kind of seeing it, and that's again the cognitive empathy, and then there's the affective empathy, and in there seems to be two buckets, sections for the affective empathy. One is emotion sharing, kind of versions of that, and then emotional reactions. So under emotional sharing, it's like, state matching. If I'm all excited, you get all excited. Or if it's similar, if I'm excited, that excitement comes over to you, and then you've caught my excitement and you get excited, or that we kind of merge so much that we kind of don't know who's who anymore. So there's sort of this
hmm
emotional losing of self in this emotional morass, or what have you. So, and then there's also, yeah, so there's different when you're I have a feeling and then somehow you get that feeling, and it could be coming from your own experience. I'm excited, then you remember, with your loved one, you are excited, then kind of that memory brings excitement to you. So it's kind of like different reasons that this emotions might match up with each other. And I think that there's in the book Against Empathy, for example, the author Paul Bloom, that's kind of what he's criticizing about empathy. He says, if you go to your therapist and you're in tears and you're crying, and then for him, empathy is that your therapist then goes into tears and then starts crying.
yeah,
And he says that that's bad. And, it's like, I agree
yeah,
with that. That's not empathy.
yeah,
That
yeah,
actually blocks empathy, right? The therapist, if he's being empathic, he's being present with your distress, maybe even acknowledging what your distress is, naming it, say, yeah, I'm hearing you're really
yeah. At,
distressed.
at the at the very minimum, he's like he's expressing that you actually feel this way. That
Right.
this is a
Uh-huh.
legitimate feeling, and that you are feeling it, and that in your worldview, from your perspective, that's a legitimate way to be reacting given the circumstances. Like, so at a minimum, he doesn't have to cry with you, certainly to be empathic, but he certainly needs to fundamentally accept. I think that's the Rogerian notion, right? Accept that that feeling state is something that you're experiencing right now in the moment, and it's a legitimate feeling state, right?
And that would be the perspective getting within your definition, right?
Yeah,
The therapist is getting your perspective, and if they're getting lost in tears and they've kind of lost the perspective and they're just getting wrapped up in their own emotional grief or what have you, and they're no longer able to
yeah.
stay present. So you have things like that. So that's actually the emotion sharing under that bucket of affective empathy. And it gets a little bit more sense. It gets kind of confusing at that point because if you're in tears, right, and then I do sense a little bit of your grief, right? I can feel the grief coming, but I don't get consumed by it. So there's empathy within that, you know, that state matching or emotional contagion, but it's not letting that kind of take over, that I'm maintaining my empathic presence with you. So
Mm,
I don't know if that,
hmm
so if that makes sense. So that's the emotion sharing under affective or emotional empathy. And then the other aspect that comes under that bucket in academia that I'm seeing is your reaction. So if you're in an emotional state and you're crying, and what is my response to it? Like instead, I can be maintain my perspective, getting my empathy, my basic empathy with you, being present, listening to you, hearing where you are, kind of going deeper, letting you go deeper in your experience and see where that experience leads. Or I can become distressed, like, oh, I'm so worried about you. And then I kind
hmm
of even lose contact with you. I'm no longer being present. I'm just wrapped up in my own personal distress at witnessing, your experience. And that they're calling empathy too. We're calling that affective empathy, which I think is not even empathy. It's sort of a block to empathy, at that point.
Yeah, but that's why some people avoid conversations about emotions, right? There's a phenomenon where if somebody is diagnosed with cancer, all of their friends suddenly vanish, right? It's because their friends can't handle the emotional toll of the disclosure of a cancer diagnosis. And that if that's empathy, I don't want any part of
Right.
that.
Uh-huh. Yeah.
I don't want any part of that.
So that's yeah, they're feeling distress, or they may be feeling sympathy. Oh, I feel so sorry for you. You've got cancer. My heart goes out to you, and then can come into sort of a state of just feeling sorry for the other person, and they're no longer present, hearing, well, what does this mean for you? What does this experience of cancer mean for you? And you're getting an understanding of what's and being present with them and getting to know what's really going on with them, at a human level, and allowing them to go more deeply into it. So the sympathy can become blocked too, as a reaction. So these reactions to what you're sensing in the other person can become blocks to empathy itself.
Mm,
And there's also, I think that's what a lot of the conservatives are criticizing. They're saying that empathy is, you see people as victims, like, oh, you've got cancer, you're a victim. I feel so sorry for you. And, it kind of, or, whatever social problems you have, I feel so sorry for you. And then you turn people into victims. That's one sort of aspect. Or you get into you see someone somehow being harmed in some way, you feel sorry for them because there's a perpetrator, and you've got a victim perpetrator dynamic. And then I don't know if you're familiar with um, the uh, drama triangle, victim drama
hmm
triangle,
Yep.
right? You kind of enter into that where you see the person as a victim, and then you fight the perpetrator, and then you yourself become a perpetrator, and it just this drama triangle, the
Right.
victim, perpetrator, rescuer, kind of goes around in a circle. So, and again, that would be sort of a reaction, just, oh, I feel sorry for you, I have to rescue you, versus, just being present maybe with both parties and trying to bring them into a mutually empathic dialogue, which, we've done with conservatives and liberals, just bring them into an empathy circle, listen to one side, listen to the other, help them to listen to each other. And so anyway, those reactions and that sympathy can also seems to be, a potential block to empathy. And yeah, and then yeah, so that's kind of like a breakdown how I'm seeing empathy, and trying to kind of take it out of that affective cognitive empathy model and bring it into the empathy circle. And with that, yeah, I was able to, trying to clarify it. So when we have these dialogues, I've reached out to all the critics of empathy, Paul Bloom, the sin of empathy, toxic empathy, you know, what I don't know. There's all these books coming out that are against empathy, and I reach out to them. I say, "Come, let's have a dialogue about it." And mostly they say no, not interested. And
Hmm.
there was one person was a student at University of Chicago, and he was writing about what he called radical empathy, seeing empathy as sort of a way that the woke left is radicalizing people to bring them into sort of the woke, cultural, activist framework. And it was basically saying that, that empathy becomes that seeing people as victims, and that you have to rescue them
Hmm.
and become an activist to do that. And by being able to kind of explain that empathy is just all sides listening to each other, and using something like the empathy circle to dialogue with each other, it really made sense to him, to the point where he says, oh, okay, I should try the empathy circle. So he wanted to try it on his college, because at the core
Yeah.
he just wants people to listen to each other. And he just felt that people are using empathy to shut down speech and stuff. So anyway, that's why I'm kind of on this bandwagon, to get a clear definition, take it out of the academic vocabulary, and at least be clear about what I'm talking about, and then try to map
Hmm.
my, I can have something to map onto all these other definitions, see how we, can,
Yeah.
yeah.
Getting away from the assumption that empathy means simply accepting the other person's perspective, not only as their truth, but the only truth.
Right. Uh-huh. Yeah.
Right. That I can also have my truth. Like I can listen to you and understand you and get your perspective and completely disagree with you. Right. And I'm not suggesting that the only alternative is then to agree to disagree and we walk away. As somebody posted on LinkedIn today that I saw, like not every situation is Thanksgiving with racist Uncle Joe, where you can just say I'm done with Uncle Joe, right? In a deliberative in a democracy, right? We have to deliberate. We have to make choices. We have to make decisions. We have to make policies, and sometimes those policies are going to be in favor of my opinion, and sometimes those policies are going to be maybe some drastically different than my opinion and perspective, and we have to have a system that allows not only for deep dialogue, understanding, and perspective getting, but also makes way for making really hard, complex decisions together, right? And so I think to a certain extent, I can then empathize with people that have an anti-empathy perspective if empathy is merely kind of a weird navel gazing activity that doesn't actually move the needle of decision making. And I'm not hearing you say that it is, but I think that's the straw man, the straw person that is often raised about empathy. It sort of defines it in a way that is easy to knock down, and doesn't complicate the actual act of what is perspective getting.
Or taking some sort of a action. You mean there's something that kind of comes out of the connection, out of the
Yeah, I
empathic
mean, and that's the
experience? Mhm.
and that's the critique of listening is like, well, listening is not action, right? If you're only listening, right, then you're not actually moving the needle or taking action. And of course, I have a a grudge to um, to launch against that as well. But so again, a misunderstanding of what true empathy is or true listening is. Um, that's where I think you get into those arguments.
Yeah, it seems there's a idea of a neutrality to it. Oh, it's just you're just being
Yeah,
neutral, and it's not positive or negative. And the it does seem to be inherently positive because when people listen to each other viscerally, generally, if they listen long enough, understand each other enough, their blood pressure goes down. There's a deeper feeling of connection, more oxytocin, which is so there's physiological things that are very beneficial. I think that doesn't get valued as sort of at its core. So, well, the reason I was really wanted to, kind of connect with you was just because you had talked about brought up the topic of empathy and it was what was the reason kind of for that you sort of did that post? Would you to
yeah, it was kind of a series of basically myth busting series where there's a lot of myths around what does it mean to be a good listener, right? And one of the wrapped up in being a good listener is this idea that we take the perspective of somebody else. And my point was
okay.
simply, you can't take the perspective of someone else. We're really bad at that. It's better if we get the perspective of somebody, and that's true. That's true empathy or empathic listening.
Yeah, because if you're doing perspective taking, you're very likely wrong. Whereas with perspective getting or
Yeah.
just kind of that basic empathy, you're sort of error checking, and it's going to
Right.
be more it's going to be more accurate.
Right.
Your experience, yeah. And so
Yeah.
where you going next with your work? What's
Um, I mean, yeah. So we're in the summer months, so I'm wrapping up some manuscripts. One of them is looking at perceptions of what it means to be a good listener from the perspective of people with ADHD or other kind of neurodivergent, sort of neurodivergent conditions, if you will. So most of the research on what constitutes high quality listening is done in neurotypical populations. And yet there are a variety of ways in which neurodivergent individuals listen in very strategic and high quality ways that don't meet the mold of normative society. And so we're starting to do some of that work, starting to write up some of that work. So that'll take my attention for the next month or so.
are you doing anything around the just the kind of the social political sort of conflict we have in the country?
One manuscript that I've been working on for like seems like 10 years now. It's been more like two. Is writing up some of the development of what's called the social cohesion impact measure. It's a free online tool for bridging organizations. So my work with Listen First project involved some research on developing some standardized ways to measure the impact of things like the empathy circle, right? Can you shift people from feeling pretty cold toward if I'm a Democrat, I feel like all Republicans are evil, or if I'm a Republican, I feel like all Democrats are evil. Can I move the needle on my perspective of people who have differences from me through some of these kind of programs, right? Some of these interventions. So um, the literature is scattered, and one of the reasons it's scattered is because there aren't standard. Because bridgers don't often measure the impact of their work, and when they do, they don't often use standardized measures, and so they get critiqued by the scientific community. They're not using the right measures, and so this was a collaboration between academics and practitioners to develop a standardized set of measurement tools to show that bridging works. And so we're writing up some of that work as well. Yeah.
Did you do any empathy circles for that?
I'm not sure there's been any pre-post studies on empathy circles, but we certainly could scaffold that if you were interested in
Yeah, if you
measuring the
ever want to
impact
do any
of that.
sort of studies about it, it's when I think there's that documentary Trump Phobia, What Both Sides Fear. We used to go to these different, pro and anti-Trump rallies, during his first time in office, and we'd sit people down from both sides, and they would just listen to each other for an hour or so, and afterwards they'd
Yeah.
give each other hugs. We got it on camera, and it was always to have some kind of studies of that. It's all kind of anecdotal, so
Right.
uh, it's
Yeah.
just
So yeah, we could certainly look into how to use that tool to put some numbers on that impact if you're interested in doing that.
sure, yeah.
Okay. Well, Edwin, man, it's always good to touch base. Thanks for reaching out and inviting me to have a chat this afternoon. I'm gonna go clean out my gutters now at my house.
Okay, well, happy gutter cleaning, and thanks for joining me
Yeah,
for a little bit of a talk here about your perspective getting uh,
awesome.
topic. So
Thanks.
a
Yep.
lot of fun.
Have a
So
good
take
weekend.
care. Bye.